Right, we're up. It's 14:04. Thank you ever so much for coming to this BERA Social Theory Special Interest and Education Special Interest Group meeting on education, social theory, and what we've termed or what we've picked up from the literature and from kind of analysis as the Polycrisis. So I'm really pleased to see you here. My name is Richard Hall. I work as a professor of education at De Montfort University. I've been here for a long time. My own kind of work and engagement with social theory is in relation to, I guess, kind of, I take a kind of Marxist humanist kind of perspective, but I'm also interested in post-colonial and anti-colonial kind of theory and thinkers, and bring that into my work in the university. So the plan for today is effectively that I'm going to give an introduction, probably just, I don't know, 4 or 5 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over or introduce one by one two guests, Manny and Jan, who I'll introduce. At the end of each of their interventions, we'll leave space for people to ask specific questions about their interventions. And then we'll move on. And then at the end, there'll be a space for people to discuss their own thinking in relation to this, their own research in relation to this, if they want. Having had a conversation, I must say a big thank you to Dan from BERA and for BERA itself for kind of hosting this and their support here. And Dan Taylor's, we've had a conversation about what will be recorded. The plan is to record Manny and Jan. Maybe even my nonsense that I will sort of talk about at the start, but we're not, the intention is not to record the kind of the conversation at the end where people might be discussing their own research and their own kind of context and that kind of thing. So that will be cut from any recording. I also want to say a really deep thank you to Manny and to Jan for joining us and giving us their insight. They've both been really, their work has been kind of inspirational, and they bring a kind of their own kind of infectious enthusiasm to kind of this work, and that's why I wanted to bring them in and to hear from them. So that's the plan for where we are. Please feel free to leave video on if you like. I'll be here throughout. When it comes to Q&A, you will have the ability to kind of unmute. You can either post stuff in the usual way in the chat if you don't want to speak, and no one is forced to speak at all. If you do want to speak, obviously raise your hands and we'll call you in. Before we started, Manny asked a really interesting question about how does this run? Is it formal or is it informal? And to which kind of flummoxed me really. And I guess for me this is a space that Jan and Manny and I discussed as we would like it to be comfortable for everybody, you know, so predicated upon kind of positive and productive and generative and generous kind of values, respect and dignity and all of that, but we would like it to be comfortable for everyone. Okay. I'm just going to say a few opening remarks about how we got here, about how I kind of came to sort of engage with this issue around Polycrisis, and then I'll call Manny and Jan in. Okay. So I suppose this is the idea of kind of crisis, and thinking about this in particular for myself from a kind of having worked in universities, having been incarcerated inside universities for the last 30 years, because I'm an old man now, trying to think about the kind of the various kind of shifts that I've seen, but I've also been a school governor across much of that period as well, including now in pupil referral units. So sort of trying to think about the ways in which we think about the material histories and the material circumstances of those institutions, and how we think about those in relation to social theory. In particular, thinking, I guess, about not just simply the after effects of the financial crisis, of the kind of collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2007, that latest kind of capitalist crisis of kind of its reproduction, but then also thinking about that in terms of a range of other constituent crises. So Eric Helena, I'll provide a set of links afterwards on the website polycrisis.org. That's a fun website if any of you kind of want to check out some of the resources there. He defines polycrisis as a cluster of distinct crises that interact in ways that they and/or their effects tend to reinforce each other, and he's focusing about the impacts there on really of economic globalization and the ways in which that leads to 5 constituent crises. He talks about trade wars, in particular between the United States and China, the move towards national self-sufficiency and protectionism in relation to sort of responses to the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and consequent sanctions, but we might also think of other geopolitical crises, Gaza in particular at the moment, but also those in the DRC, in Sudan, and elsewhere. He argues in relation to trade restrictions against countries which have lax regulation in relation to climate change. Doesn't specifically focus upon anthropogenic forcing or climate forcing, but focuses upon this in relation to the economy. And the weakening of democracy. He focuses as his 5th crisis about the weakening of democracy. And I think each of those we can think about those in relation to kind of, well, what about how does theory help us engage with that? But also within that, what are the ramifications of that for education and educational context? And other thinkers think about this or analyze this differently. So the Marxist theorist Michael Roberts, former economist, Michael Roberts, he focuses upon this in relation to what he calls the long depression after that kind of financial crash of 2007. And we might also then want to think about that in relation to that kind of the fact that other things have been brought to our attention in educational contexts. So they've been ever present. Things like the kind of issues of racial, patriarchal, settler colonial realities, the impact of kind of coloniality, that kind of thing, the ruptures around Black Lives Matter, and the ways in which they have impacted our thinking about education and educational contexts. And for me, when I was thinking about that as well, then I was thinking about the responses of the United Nations or standard kind of liberal responses to this. So the United Nations Human Development Report for 23-24 asks for 4 questions. Why does pursuing the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement feel like a half-hearted slog through quicksand? They argue, or they question. They ask why in many places does restoring peace, even pauses or ceasefires as hopeful preludes to peace, feel so elusive? They argue, why are we immobilized on digital governance while AI races ahead in a data gold rush? And in short, they ask, why are we so stuck and how do we get unstuck without resorting myopically to violence or isolationism? And each of those questions, I think, have impacts for higher education, for other education sectors. And they relate, I suppose, to, in pragmatically, to some of the issues that were raised last week by the Office for Students when they were discussing the financial sustainability of higher education, and they're focused upon volatility. They don't necessarily address these issues of climate forcing, of other kind of crises, of economic crisis, beyond the kind of ways in which that is impacting financial projections. This also relates to other education sectors, I guess, when we're thinking about, say, the Institute for Fiscal Studies annual report on education spending in England. Their last report for 2023 focuses upon a real set of differences that are experienced within communities, but also how they are visited on different educational institutions based upon geography and funding in relation to geography, and how that enables communities to mitigate or adapt to these crises. Also thinking about disadvantage, so where education spending and funding and policy, for instance, are targeted, and how do we make sense of those, thinking about those through theory and educational research. So that then reminded me, in the context of this theory, educational research and crisis, of Sara Ahmed's statement early on, I think, in Living a Feminist Life, where she argues that theory does more the closer to the skin that it gets. And this again reasons why I wanted to sort of invite Manny and Jan to speak with us, because they have done some of that work on kind of lived experience and that kind of that relationship between the skin and theory. The final point I want to make before I hand over to Manny in the first instance, really, in this is some work that thinking about who's in the context of this, whose narratives are kind of heard within this space, and issues, I suppose, of visibility and invisibility within our thinking here. So, Doreen Martinez in a piece, I think from 2014, on who has the right to be free of fear, is centering indigeneity in some of our responses and our ways of kind of theorizing and thinking about theory within our work. So, and she talks about the ways in which we might want to rename, reposition, and advocate and support people in their own self-advocacy in relation to catastrophic environmental loss, climate change complications, rather than merely providing or imposing a response to that. And I think that really helps us, or helps me, think about alternative responses that I might want to listen to, but that have been ever present. They're just made more visible now, or if I look, I might be able to kind of engage with those both theoretically and materially. So in this workshop then, or in this session, I've invited Manny and Jan in because I respect their work. Their work has influenced my own, and they come from a couple of quite different perspectives, I think, to think about the ways in which social theory might be applied to educational research in relation to, or at the intersection of, global crises. And I guess I've invited them in really because I see it as a privilege to be joined by people who are inspiring and courageous in their thinking in relation to this. The previous book I wrote was titled The Hopeless University. And I'm very interested in how we, in a negative critique, and how we work through hopelessness in order to kind of recover hope. And I see both Jan and Manny's work in challenging me in relation to that. So that's enough from me. That's a kind of opening gambit, kind of a rough kind of sketch of where I was coming from in setting this up. I'm going to invite Manny, and he's going to share some slides and then talk to us for a few minutes, or 20 odd minutes. Do we agree 20 odd minutes, Manny? You got as long as you like. I don't.
20 minutes is fine. It's fine. We'll see how it goes. If I overrun because I talk loads, I'm sorry.
That's no. There are no apologies here. No apologies. Can I just say one thing? I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, Manny, but I'd just like to say that to people who don't know you, that I've always been drawn to your infectious nature and commitment to social justice through kind of collective inquiry. I do quite like your focus on hope in what can feel like hopeless times. So if you want to say a little bit about you and about where you are currently based and your background, that would be brilliant. And I'm just going to hand over to you, Manny.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you, Richard, for and Dan, as well as Jan, just to be a part of this space. And I'm going to try and talk as freely as possible with the utmost humility. But yeah, so I'm originally from California, from Esalen Lands. I was born in Esalen Lands. And I came over to England to do university work at University of Sheffield. And I am based currently at University of Nottingham as associate professor in education. And thank you for asking me about my background, because it relates to where I'm going to go in my intervention here. Is that when I was doing my PhD studies, I was working at Sheffield Hallam at the same time. So I was doing my PhD at University of Sheffield and working at Sheffield Hallam. And at Sheffield Hallam, I worked in disabled student support. And so and I have an interest in inclusive assessments currently. So Jan's work on assessment has been really, really informative. And also at the same, I moved from disabled student support team, working with disabled students, to widening participation. And so I always have this question about, can the university or higher education or the academy, particularly here in the UK context, can it ever be inclusive? Can it ever be that place where social justice can be achieved? And I really appreciate this space and being invited into this BSA. Can I just say, this is my first time I ever presented on a BSA platform ever. I never engaged with BSA, so this is my first time. So folks, be nice. All right. So what I'm going to talk about today, my intervention today, is I'm going to talk about some research I did, but it's basically a reflection on the research. So I'm not going to talk about the methods, or it's just what my thinking is, particularly when it comes to social theory. And I appreciate that Richard mentioned that I'm currently doing some work on hope, and I didn't land on hope. Hope wasn't something it was something that I was pursuing. It came from actually research. It came from the findings that I got doing research around widening participation and race a few years ago. And it was through looking, and I guess one thing to insert here is that research is messy. Yeah, it's not linear it's not perfectly linear. And so when I reflect on the social theories that I'm going to share with you, it has stemmed from the evidence that I found rather than me being informed, looking for hope. Yeah. So the way this intervention is going to be presented to you is, it seems linear, but it's not. Okay. So I'm conscious of time. So what I'm going to do is just talk for the next about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'll pass it back to Richard. Is that okay, Richard? Can I get a head nod? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so yes, there is a crisis. And when I was pursuing this research a few years ago on widening participation, I was looking at the absence of discourse around race at the time, particularly around policy and what the folks were saying around the sector, particularly around practitioners. And the focus was on white working class boys. So that was the discourse. That was the whole thing with politicians as well as practitioners and some of the initiatives that were kicking off across the sector. And that got me worried. That got me worried about stuff, because when it comes to higher education, I always think about distribution of resources. How are resources being distributed, and how is that not only classed but also racialized? How that distribution works, and how that distribution reflects a hierarchy. Okay. So that was my research question at the time, and I was probably more informed with critical race theory than I am now. And so I was just looking at why the absence. And I was working off the work of Dave Gilborn, who was basically made the argument in 2005 that English educational policy reflects, I forgot the exact phrasing, but I'm paraphrasing here, is white supremacist. Yeah. So that was a paper he presented I believe at a Bear conference as well, around 2004, 2005. And it just got me thinking. So I was looking for the despair. Yeah. And I knew the evidence that existed in the sector. So I have on my slide that the presence of Black professors, this is a bit dated, but the presence of Black professors is still lacking within the sector. I believe there are more. I believe there are more than 30 now, way more than 30 now, compared to 4,340 white female professors throughout the UK, as well as students getting in and accessing universities, particularly different universities entering into higher education. So there's a lot of dooming statistics, despairing statistics that we have to sit around. If you ever sat in the EDI meeting at your university, I always consider that space, but in some spaces a place of despair. But you also hear it in the dominant discourse as well around higher education. So I mentioned something about how politicians at the time, 5, 6, 7 years ago, particularly Boris Johnson's brother, Joe Johnson, was signifying the white working class. We need to look at the white working class. Labor did it as well. And how some critical race theorists viewed that was taking the eyes off race. So basically, we don't see race in the UK as we do in the States. But we see that in policy today. So we see that how international students are viewed. And Richard mentioned something about funding the sector, like every university struggling, but in particularly for widening participation students, who that is the group of my focus of research, is how the hierarchy, even within the sector, there's a racial hierarchy. Which students, particularly students of color, would attend, and the students that would attend higher education would flow through to the post 92s, where the sector is being hit hard at the moment. And I have to think about what's happening around the globe at the moment, the dismantling of EDI offices in the States, and the rhetoric around equality, diversity, and inclusion, and how U.S. states and Texas and Florida are taking those offices out of the shelves, out of the university, pushing it away. And that reflects what has happened in Hungary with the leadership over there, about and the racist rhetoric of the leadership. And then we got to look at what's happening today, and the encampments, and the bravery and the courageousness of our students in terms of this topic of academic freedom. And so, in a way, higher education across the globe is a place of contention, of conflict, and so I know I'm doing research on widening participation, but when I theorize what's going on, I go, okay, there's a lot of despair here. And so amongst this despair, where's the hope? So that's where, when I did the research, I was looking, and I interviewed widening participation practitioners around the sector here in England. I found that I was looking for the despair and why we're not talking about race, and what I got back were stories of hope. Yeah, with stories of encouragement as a researcher, or as a human, or as just it was something. I was looking for the despair and the evilness of the academy, and what I got were stories of hope. Yeah, and so it made me think about hopeful scholarship. It made me think about, okay, how come no one's talking about hope? I know, like Freire, I mean, we as educators, we know that Freire has a book called Pedagogies of Hope. We know Bell Hook's written that book, Teaching to Transgress. But as academics, particularly in higher education, I think we're trained to be critical and look into the despair, and not paying attention to hope. I don't know. That's just my kind of sense at the moment. So I wanted to lean into that. And there was a book, The Third University is Possible, by Le Pauperson. So Le Pauperson is a pen name for Wayne Yang, Wayne Yang is a co-author with Eve Tuck, and this popular article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. If some of you who work in decolonization may know that article. So he written a book, and from that book he leaned into hope in that book, and he talked about us being cyborgs. And you may see the spelling on my slides with the S. S stands for structure, and I have problems with it. But anyways, I'll talk about that later. But this is, he's theorizing hope, all right? So this is an attempt. And he used the image of R2-D2. So for those familiar with the Star Wars story, R2-D2 is this robot that goes into the Death Stars and rewires it for rebellious purposes. And I think it helps blow up the empire. So he was using that as an analogy to how we as academics and as students and staff members could operate as cyborgs. We're wired by the university, but we can decolonize it by rewiring it for social justice reasons, for decolonizing reasons. But I did have a problem with this whole thing about why is he was theorizing, but he was trying to use these concepts of structure and agency, which is in educational research, which is quite popular, particularly for those who are into French sociology. And I always had a problem, which I'm recently finding that the concept structure problematic. And so I obviously you can see me reflecting. I'm thinking about theory and thinking about, for decades, everyone's going on about structure and agency, and I haven't really found someone shed light. Richard Jenkins shed light to me about, no one has actually kind of explained what structure is. Yeah, just something I'm throwing out there, and I did allude to it recently prior to this meeting. I know I got 10 minutes left, I think. I got a few more slides that I want to share with you. Thank you. Right, so as I think about higher education, I think about the findings I got from the writing participation practitioners who I interviewed. It made me reflect on a bunch of theories from folks to make sense of not only that hope, but also make sense of the world. So now at the moment, I'm thinking about the work of Charles Mills, the racial contract. And how essentially he was critical on the social contract, social contractarians, for instance, like Hobbes and Locke. And he was saying that the racial contract undergirds the social contract because of who counts and who's included within that social contract. And it's usually those who are included on the social contract are not necessarily people of color. And he goes on through this historical, philosophical exploration of how the world has been divided, us versus them, yeah, and how it's been divisive. But I guess one of the key things I got from it is the social interaction bit. And I think in terms of interaction, I go, that's how we operate. So when I don't think of structure is something that's just far away, but when I think of interaction, that's someone next to me, yeah? And that's what it got me to Richard Jenkins' work, where he emphasized about social interaction, the individual interacting with a collectivity, yeah, in our relationship with that. And so that made me think that my identity, in order for me to have an identity or a collective identity as an American or as British, I know there are ways of operating as American or operating as a Brit or as British. I know there's a distinction between us and them. In order for me to have a sense of us, there has to be a them. So therefore there has to be something more than the sum of the parts that holds us together. Yeah, as a society, yeah, or as a collectivity. And then I draw on Derek Bell, and Derek Bell is the one that gives me hope. So I used to read Derek Bell as someone who just despaired at the state of play in the States, but actually he was writing from a place of hope. And then Les Back did some work around London. And I'll talk more about what Les Back did, because I think I'll probably end it towards the Les Back bit. So Derek Bell is credited as one of the founders of critical race theory, and one of the things that he brings, he shares, that he offers in his scholarship is this idea of racial realism, and racial realism is the idea that racism is permanent. So what he means by permanent is permanent as in it's not fixed, but it's racism is always going to be there. It's just part of the fabric of our society. It's just going to be there, yeah. And we have to just acknowledge it. And he says to acknowledge this, that it's always going to be there, that it's always there, actually frees us to imagine and implement racial strategies that can bring triumph, or that can bring fulfillment and even triumph. So just acknowledging that it's there, and that's our starting point, is where he says that's where the hope can be born from, particularly in terms of racial justice. Hopefully I'll come. And I think a picture of this. There's two pictures that he draws of. If you know his writing, he writes in a composite way, and one of it is a person he met along the way when he was working in civil rights in the 60s, and it was and there's a person called Mrs. McDonald, and Mrs. McDonald knew she wanted to go and vote in the 60s in the South. But she knew that by going and doing that work, going and promoting democracy, getting her community, her church to vote, this Black woman, and walking towards to vote to the office, she knew that she was going to face ridicule from she knew that the banks, the local bank was going to increase her finances. She knew that her son was going to lose his job because of her participation in this democratic process. But the way that Derek Bell written about Mrs. McDonald, in the face of white in the face of white oppressors in the South of America in the 1960s, was that her goal was defiance, and how that defiance was freeing, was liberating. So he written, struggle for freedom is a manifestation of our humanity that survives and grows stronger through resistance to oppression, even if that oppression is never overcome. Yeah. And I found that was lovely. So although the racism is permanent, the struggle against it brings a sense of humanity, brings a sense of triumph, brings a sense of hope. And he also written another character, Erica Richler, in his essay Divining a Racial Realism Theory. And Erica Richler is a white woman who he phrases as a white abolitionist, and who was armed, had a gun. And in this essay, he was saying, he kind of presented Erica Richler as this white abolitionist who probably would have helped free the slaves during the underground slavery in North America when slavery was around. Was one of those white abolitionists like the figure of John Brown, if you know anything about American history, is that he was a white abolitionist that used arms to free slaves. Yeah. And that was a nice image, not of like a white ally, but of just being human. Yeah. Of just jumping into that hope. Now, as I'm moving to these theories bits, okay, documenting hope. So this is where I get into reflecting on the methods that I did for this research, and thinking about all these ideas that were popping on my head, because those practitioners that I interviewed were just flipped. They would just encourage and affirm. They gave me something different. I was looking for poison, and they gave me antidote for the poison that I was digesting. And Les Beck, he's a sociologist. I think he was at I forget the name, but it's the one that's not doing Goldsmiths. Yeah, and I believe he's at Glasgow now. And he is a white sociologist, and he walked the streets of London looking for hope, documenting hope. And he's one of these folks that is seeking to find hope and advancing hopeful scholarship. So one of the things that he does, he's an ethnographer. And so he found hope in two different spaces in time, a particular time and space in London when he was writing this in late 2018. And one example, one he found in the Grenfell commemoration. If those for folks who don't know, they commemorate the tragedy of Grenfell with a silent march through London. And he found that as one example of a space of hope. And also and now when I'm talking really fast, but the space of hope is a place of racial repair. There you go. So where he finds repair for tragedy, or racial repair of communities coming together of different race ethnicities in order to advance racial repair of healing. Yeah. So Les Beck found that in the Grenfell commemoration, but he also found it in a pub where outside the doors, two racists came out of this pub, and they committed a violent act against a person of color. And in that neighborhood, in that estate, it was known as a racist pub. And then that pub closed down, and then the local community ended up getting ownership of the pub as a community, and it's become a community organization, community center, where they share oral history of that working class neighborhood, where now it has become a site of racial repair. But tragedy occurred back in, it was known as a pub of like racist violence. Now it's become a place of racial repair that's known throughout the community. Yeah. So Lesback went and documented this, and he goes, part of the role of a hopeful scholarship is to portray and document an inventory of those moments of repair that suture damage where hate gives way to love, convivial coexistence, bridges divisions, exclusions, where islands of hope emerge from within the midst of despair. So if I backtrack a couple of slides, remember I was talking about this transactional process of identity, us versus them. And so Lesback is saying bridges between that transactional process, yeah, of healing from that divide. Okay, 2 more slides and I'm through. Is that okay? Thank you. Okay. I know I'm talking fast. Please send me an email, contact me, put your questions on the chat. It's lovely. It's just lovely to just air this out and share with you. So as I think about the methods that I pursued, so I went out and did these one-to-one interviews with folks, and it made me think, to like, if usually when I think about decolonizing methods traditionally, I always thought about, okay, is my research practice going to reproduce a colonial power relationship? And it's usually around racialized ethnic groups who I may be interviewing, but not necessarily with white respondents that I interview. But after having done that project, and it made me question who my community was. It made me question, hey, hold on, like it made me question, like, what am I doing as a researcher? Because I went out to look for something, but I didn't want to reproduce the practice. But it made me question whether or not who my community is in terms of not being oppressive, and particularly with the white respondents who gave me their heart and soul in those stories, and representing them, even though I know that there's this power dynamic and white supremacy still exists and it perpetuates and is permanent. But it made me think that there's colleagues who have that privilege, who I feel I'm in community with, and how can I represent that in an affirming way and be critical? And so it made me think, and I'll leave this question here. It was that, who is my community, and how can I talk about community in a way that recognizes a divide, but also recognizes that power as well of that divide, the racial divide. And I'm going to leave this here. I'll leave it with this quote, and this will be my last slide. I promise. Okay. There, in one of the interviewees, there's a widening participation regional manager that was heading up an initiative for a big city. And so I'm leaving you with this anecdote, and then I'll end. Is that she wanted to do 2 things. One, she wanted to open up a discussion in her EDI meeting that she was running with different university representatives in this region to talk about race. Yeah. She didn't have to do that, but she wanted to do that because of recent events with George Floyd at the time. So she created that space. She didn't have to, but she created that space. But also, she wanted to challenge the dominant narrative on the discourse on the policy regarding white working class boys. She goes, no, I don't want to distribute resources, capacity, and time to that, because those in my community that are not accessing HE, particularly Russell Group universities, are Black and Pakistani groups. So I want to direct particular resource and capacity towards those groups within the local community. And she got a lot of flack for that. She didn't have to do that. She was a white manager, but for me, she was one of those folks that I saw the work that she was doing that was affirming and encouraging me. And I was equating her with Derek Bell's picture of Erica Weschler, and that being a white abolitionist in those spaces. And so it was that kind of those stories, and she did talk about the emotions of chairing that meeting, that I found I have to talk about my respondents in a proper way, not in an encouraging way, in an affirming way. So I'm going to leave it to you with that as a question mark, as I still try to excavate what hopeful scholarship is. Okay, thank you, everyone. I end.
Manny, that's great. You remind me, if anybody has any kind of questions, please feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat for Manny. Manny, you remind me of when I was reading a book called The End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the sort of in the end days, effectively in the path of climate disruption. He's a former kind of, I don't know if you know his work, but he used to work on Democracy Now, and he's a former mountaineer and war reporter. Reporter during the Iraq War, and he talks about the fact that we can't do each of us cannot do everything. It is impossible for us to be the person who puts our bodies in the way, who is doing the social reproduction, who is doing the cooking, cleaning, whatever it might be. But there is a very important place for bearing witness, and for, I guess, as Akile Mbembe might argue, or makes me think about, sort of expanding the archive so that we have more of this.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
is that kind of where I'm wondering about, is that where you situate your kind of research in terms of, I'm not saying you're not an activist in other spaces, but does that seem to be a fundamental part of your role as an educator and a researcher, thinking about social theory at this point, and in relation to a range of crises that are materially impacting individuals and communities?
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. I mean, we need to document, particularly in the sector that we work in. Like, we need to be documenting that hope, because we don't do it as often, and we don't know how these stories of hope encourages us as educators to withstand the onslaught of the polycrisis. Like, we know that our universities, and Lepopperson, who I quoted, that his university contributes to the military enterprise, gets money from Shell, from petroleum, that causes damage to indigenous land. But how are we able to do work, rewire the university in some respects, taking his words, and share that with others in order to encourage one another that we can do this as educators? Yeah, and to sorry,
I was only going to ask you, and your relationship to theory specifically within that process, then.
Yeah, most definitely. That is the backbone of to make sense of what we're doing. And I mean, I didn't dive into utopian studies and the theorizations of hope as much as I possibly could, because I don't because my work does dabble in utopian studies, but that kind of drives this whole thing about hopeful scholarship. The theorization of it, particularly that attempt from Lepopperson, is something to build on. Yeah.
That's cool. All right. Thanks, Manny. Thanks so much. Any other questions? Put them in the chat. Although Manny's going to disappear at 3:05, but to go on the score run, but will be available for Q&A. As long as you're going to take care, Manny, crossing roads and whatever it is.
Oh, it's only up the road. It's only up the road. The school's just right there.
Awesome. Thank you ever so much. Our second speaker, Jan MacArthur. Again, Jan, I'll let you introduce yourself. You'll do a much better job than me. Super interesting to chat with you prior to coming on the call about your history at Lancaster, having been there doing your PhD, a scholar and a teacher there for a decade, and now head of department. It's a big old department as well. I think it's important. I just want to center before you introduce yourself. The fact that your work has been really important for me in thinking about that interconnection between lived experiences and how, I guess, kind of theories of decoloniality and epistemic justice, for instance, in the context of assessment, something as concrete as assessment in educational spaces, impacts our kind of educational practices, but also how that work on lived experience, decoloniality, epistemic justice might impact our work at the level of society. For me, it's a kind of pedagogic project at the level of society that is infused by theory at a time when things feel like they're falling apart really badly. So your work gives me hope in that space. So thank you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Richard. That's a lovely introduction. Let me see if I can succeed in sharing my slides this time, before he failed once. Okay, can you see them?
Yeah, they're in. They're not present. Yeah, they're presenting. That's great.
Okay, now great. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm sort of wish I didn't have to follow Manny, because I just want to sit and think about what he's just talked about, which was so fabulous. So I think our two talks will interconnect quite well. I'll probably talk too fast as well. I think I timed this about 25 minutes. I didn't realize I should be doing 20, but we'll see how we go. So I'm Jan MacArthur, and my interest, I love theory. I love theory, but I love bringing theory down to everyday activities. And I feel there's a real responsibility to do that. And I suppose that comes through in my work, I hope. So talking about polycrisis, this is a slide I've used before, but we live in a time where we can have drought and flood and bushfires all at the same time, if you come from Australia like me. So we have obvious climate catastrophe. We have war and poverty, and even in so-called rich countries like this, we have cost of living that is making everyday lives genuinely miserable and below the standards of proper humanity. So in this context, the theorist I use a lot, Adorno, I've sort of decided he's the prince of polycrisis, because, if you're going to have someone who's going to, oh goodness me, you're going to have someone who's going to talk about the world doom and gloom, this is your man, or so they say. Stephen Brookfield said that reading him brings on a pessimistic fit of the vapours. People talk about the staring into the Grand Hotel abyss. But when Manny was talking about hope, and I was thinking, I wanted to make sure that hopefulness comes through in mine as well. And I remember something I wrote in a chapter about Adorno, which I sort of liked, and I said, life never became so bleak and awful that Adorno gave up thinking it was important to tell people it was bleak and awful. So that's my pessimistic view on Adorno, but I'll come back to him in a minute. What I want to do is, I suppose I'm positioning this talk as about why theory is important, why social theory is important if you're an educational researcher. And what is not important for is being a tick box. And I really hate this. Now, even in my own institution, we have PhD confirmation documents where there's a heading, theoretical framework, and it's so artificial. And that's where students go looking and think, oh, I've got to have a theoretical framework. Before they actually have a need for one, they just artificially impose it. And I was joking before on MA programs, it's nearly always Bourdieu, but that's okay. But theory in educational research is not just a tick box. We use it when it's meaningful, and sometimes we can use it in a very gentle, nuanced way, and sometimes we use it in a pretty big, heavy way. And for me, the reason why we use theory is to help us understand our destination. So this does link to hope. Our destination for me in my work is greater social justice within and through higher education. And theory lets me know if I'm getting anywhere down that road travelled. Otherwise, it could just all be talk. In terms of education and social justice specifically, which is, I suppose, my research area, I strongly believe there is a need to theorise social justice so that we can understand that sense of how far down the road we are. It makes research into something where something happens. Sorry, that sentence is a bit weird. And of course, Adorno, some of you may know, one of the really big things from his work is understanding that interrelationship between theory and practice. And theory, for me, to sort of misquote Adorno, theory is one of the most practical things, and practice does no good unless there's thinking behind it. And so I believe that this working with theory and practice in that way is the road to genuine social change. It's not an easy road, but that is the road. And of course, social justice can mean many things. And I even in academic circles get people saying, well, just don't bother. We shouldn't do research on social justice because it could be many things. Well, yeah, so could probably anything if you think about it. Then there's the problem that it can be a fluffy and feel-good term or a buzzword where it actually has no meaning because we just say it because, well, I'm a social justice researcher because I'm one of the good guys and, I don't go to Starbucks sort of thing. But for me, and the reason I use critical theory is that it's neither relativist nor positivist, but it gives you provisional stability to understand where you are and where you might be. And critical theory for me is about using a form of knowledge that's complex and not easily known, because the social world is hard to know. And in Adorno's terms, efforts to simplify our understanding of the world around us and the people around us tend to destroy them. So if you talk to your neighbour and you try and categorise them into certain categories, that's not the person they are. It's always more complex and nuanced. But there are different theories of social justice, and particularly if you're new to social justice educational research, this can be a bit confusing. And what I want to say is there's no need for these necessarily to compete with one another. It's not like the 1990s and you had to choose Blur or Oasis. You couldn't support both. And they can learn from one another, and they do, and we can see that through the history of ideas. But we do need to be aware of sort of pick and mix, because you need to understand the epistemological consistency of different ideas if you choose to bring them together. And so if there is any mismatch, at least that's deliberate, and you're in control of the ideas in a sense, rather than just trying to put a whole lot of bag of shiny things in and think it makes your work look more interesting. So theories of social justice in this and last century, clearly the landmark work of John Rawls, The Theory of Justice, which is a procedural, sort of liberal social contract view of social justice. It's enormously influential. And I really believe that, obviously not everybody reads this, but the idea of linking justice with fair procedure is, to me, highly embedded in society, and particularly when we talk about something like assessment. Then we have Amartya Sen, fabulous, came in with a completely different way, an economist who said we have to understand the world differently. Very, very different to Rawls, much more focused on outcomes, not procedure, but still probably in a liberalish tradition. Then I think actually going back to be a bit more liberal, Martha Nussbaum, built on Sen's work, again, developing the idea of a capabilities approach of social justice. And then we have critical theory coming in, people like Nancy Fraser. And this book, which I absolutely adore, is Honneth and Fraser debating one another about the relative importance of redistribution or recognition in how we understand social justice. And it is such a beautiful act of academic collegiality, because they don't hold back criticising one another, but it's respectful, and it's just really what we need to see more of. But what I'd say is there's a history through these ideas, but you can't just mix and match them. You can't, use a bit of Rawls and pop in a bit of Honneth. That really wouldn't work, and you have to be a bit careful of that. I'm sorry, I'm sort of speaking here to newer researchers in the room. So in my own work, and I've called this talk From Honneth to Adorno, which, if you know critical theory, or you can tell from the photos, seems the wrong way round, because of course Adorno came first. But there's a reason why I want to do that. I want to talk about how I found Honneth particularly useful in talking about everyday lived experiences, but why I can never give up on my need to use Adorno. And actually in my own work, I did do it the other way round. I'm sorry, I'm using my work here as examples, not to try and publicize them as good examples. I'm just explaining how I've used theory in my work. So I hope it doesn't seem like I'm being a bit boastful. So in my first book about knowledge, it was very much using Adorno. But then my second book on assessment, I sort of wanted to do something different. And even though I would claim my first book is very, very practical, nothing's more practical than thinking about knowledge. My second book really was trying to say, I want to influence practices here in this way. And I think that's why I moved on to Honneth. So the thing with Honneth that really helped my work and gave me a focus was his understanding of social justice as mutual recognition. And I love this quote. We know that what is just by that which allows the individual member of our society to realise his or her own life objectives in cooperation with others and with the greatest possible autonomy. There's critical theory for you. The brilliant paradox of cooperation and autonomy, the ability to be able to think on both those planes and not see them as alternatives or in conflict. And it's actually this interplay of individual and social well-being, which for me is fundamental to the forms of social justice that I want to use and the sorts of changes I think we need to work towards within HE and society. So this is my, I'm not going to say working definition, this is my working understanding of social justice, if I had to sum it up in more than several papers. And it's okay if yours is different. It still means we can be scholars together. It's just about you understanding the foundation upon which my ideas develop. And you read someone else, you read Manny, and he laid out today a different foundation of ideas so that you can engage with his ideas. And I just think that's the lovely thing about scholarship, and particularly in the realm of social justice and change. So to very briefly outline Honneth's idea of social justice as mutual recognition, this is a very superficial account, but I do that so that it's accessible for us all. And also, I don't think that theory needs to always be complex, even though I read all these German theorists who make it sound complex. It's okay to sometimes distill ideas that are communicable and usable. So he has three realms of mutual recognition, and they're not separate. They together form a sense of what human beingness is, because that's what social justice is about, isn't it? It's about us being able to be human beings in all the lovely things that involves. So the first is love or care recognition, which is about an individual. So it's not just a general idea of fatherly love. It's the recognition this father gives his son when he looks at him and cares for him and wipes his tears away. That knowledge that you exist as a person and that you matter and you're recognised by others. So it's a very sort of intimate, close form of recognition. By contrast, respect or rights recognition is a universal form. And this is about the rights that we should all share, but it's not just about having those. It's about us being citizens who can understand and use our rights. And through that, we are recognised by others as members of civic society, useful members, and that we recognise that in ourselves. And mutual recognition is about self-recognition too. It's okay to recognise in yourself that you are a good person trying to navigate civil society. And then finally, esteem or merit recognition, which is the easiest to map onto assessment, is about the particular skills, dispositions or knowledge that we have that make a contribution to the well-being of others, and therefore also contribution to our own well-being, because those two are interconnected. So it might be learning to create some vaccine. It might be being someone who plays the harp and it floats out through the window, creates beautiful music that makes other people happy. It could be being a great accountant that helps somebody, you know, so it's about that idea, but it's the recognition. It's the recognition of yourself and the recognition from others that matters. And in the book I wrote on assessment, I did something which I'm still not sure was the right thing to do. But because I very much wanted to direct this to influencing practices, and I'm very influenced by social practice theory, I brought in Shatsky, and particularly the fourth aspect he has in understanding what a social practice is, which is a slightly unusual thing. He calls it general understandings, but it's really about senses of worth. So how a sense of worth shapes a practice. So for an artist and crafts person, there is a sense of worth in working with that pencil and that chisel and not manufacturing 100 chairs quickly through a machine. And so that sense of worth is shaping the practice. And I thought this might be a helpful way to try and bring to life what I was trying to do in the assessment book, which was very much to say, not only is there a mandate for change in assessment, here are some scaffolds to help us think about what we could and should do differently. And so I came up with these five, what you call senses of worth, and said that these really should shape our assessment practices. It's not an exclusive list, but it is a list generated from reading around this to think what sort of covers it and what sort of covers. And this is where I am slightly extending Honneth beyond what he expected to be done with his theory, but that's okay as long as I'm clear to people I'm doing that. And a sense that we need to have assessment practices imbued with relationships of trust and honesty, because these are essential to recognising our basic human beingness, responsibility, knowing the rules of the game, being able to use them, forgiveness, because learning is all about making mistakes, but our assessment processes are so unforgiving, and responsiveness being that link to the broader social world. So I sort of put forward this as really the things to think about. Now, of course, in every individual assessment reform, you might not be doing all of them, but let's just think about the idea of trust. And I have to tell you, I got a lot of flack from some of the big name assessment researchers for talking about trust and assessment. And I think, though, now, today, everyone's talking about trust, because actually in an age of AI, we don't really have much left. But trust is really important for what we're trying to achieve in actually not just care, but also respect and esteem forms of recognition. And I recently talked to some lawyers, and they're a tough crowd, but there's something weird happens in legal education. And it goes a bit like this: because lawyers do such important work, and you could put in here doctors, other people, because they do such important work, we must have robust forms of assessment. Well, that makes sense. Therefore, we cannot afford to trust students, because it is vital that we produce trustworthy lawyers. So you see the problem. We haven't really thought through what we're doing. And I said to these lawyers, show me in your curriculum, this is sample one, show me where trust comes in. Where do we know the point that graduate is going to be a trustworthy lawyer and not rip off the old lady who comes in for conveyancing? Is it going to be there? Is it going to be there? And of course, they can't say, because never do they trust their students. And we could go through this in terms of things like, you know, the capacity to demonstrate esteem recognition could be there in the same way. And working on this idea of trust and lawyers, and also some empirical work I did on a big project, I came around through my assessment work to look at the idea of authentic assessment, which, if you talk a lot about assessment, as I do, it's a big concept. Everyone's talking about authentic assessment, and I just wasn't happy with how that was being done. And I thought it was very, very untheorized, and it was a concept that would jolly well benefit from a good bit of theory. And so that's what I tried to do. And so my critique was based on this idea that people were saying that authentic assessment is about real world tasks. And then they very quickly conflated real world with the world of work. And that was external to students. And how offensive is that? Is to say to your students, you're here and there's a real world out there and you're not part of it. and you can't change it, and you just have to accept what they want. So in other words, authentic assessment quickly becomes what employers want, and it quickly becomes assessment for a compliant workforce. And when we look at the problems of our polycrisis, a compliant workforce is not what is going to solve it. It will not solve the planet. And so I offered, sorry, I'm doing a bit of trouble with PowerPoint at the moment, just this side, yeah. So I offered this theorization of what actually should matter if we wanted to call assessment authentic. And I had a bit of fun because some of you may know that Adorno wrote a book called The Jargon of Authenticity, which was one of his, great critiques of Heidegger. So that was sort of a little bit of self-indulgent fun on the side for me. But the core of it was that if we're really thinking about authentic assessment, an authentic assessment that matters in a world that we want to change for the better, we have to stop thinking about the real world of work and talk about society, because we are all interlinked. And we have to move from the task performance to why we value the task. There are an awful lot of tasks in the world that are not worth doing. And in fact, they're the tasks that are causing the polycrisis. So let's think about why we value a task. And finally, we have to move from affirmation to transformation. So from not just fiddling at the edges is the wrong word, but we have to really be prepared for the fact that there's a big rethink needed here. At the same time, I think we can begin our big rethink in little small places, because we have to start somewhere. I'm just looking at the clock. And so effectively, if we take a law curriculum, where do we find those moments of mutual recognition? They don't have to be everywhere, but somewhere a student has to come to value themselves and what they have learnt through more than a grade, through a sense, I have been schooled in legal education and I can now go out and play a useful role in society which will be helpful to others and will help me fulfill myself. That's what we should be doing. So from Honest to Adorno, I am just not giving Adorno quite so much space, but there's a reason for that. So I hope I've showed you how I find I can take a theory like Honest and how it's so usable when I want to say to people, my colleagues, when they're doing assessment, to try and make a meaningful change that has some depth and is thought through, so it's not just a tinkering, and so that we can have bigger, better conversations about change. But I come back to Adorno because, I call him my Prince of Polycrisis. And the thing about Honeth is there's quite a lot of debate, and I think he's got the debates himself about it, is the extent to which he has drifted from the radical roots of the Frankfurt School critical theory. And I think there's a little bit of a case for that. And so for me, it's almost like, what's the opposite of sugar in your tea? But, I need that bit of Adorno to bring me back and remind me of certain things that are fundamental to the commitment to social justice and the reason why theory is so much a part of shaping practice. And so, but first, just a quick aside, I want to say social theory itself has a history. And so the critical theory, particularly the Frankfurt School, is not without its faults. And I went through a really deep personal crisis when I tried to write this paper on critical theory in a decolonial age. And really, I had to just admit, these people got it wrong. They made a choice not to engage with colonialism, which is bizarre, given they were critiquing capitalism. Hello, how did we build capitalism? So they didn't engage with colonialism, and therefore they didn't engage with race. And I have this picture, look at this. Captain Cook, and the only black face is this strange person here holding the drinks. I mean, there's so much that they should have critiqued and they should have known about. And time is not itself an excuse. But I still think that acknowledging that this is useful theory. And I want to quickly bring in Nancy Fraser. I'm like Manny, I'm looking at the time. Who I should have mentioned in my abstract, who's North American, but very much fits in the Frankfurt School tradition. And she makes the distinction between affirmative change and transformative. So affirmative change is something like the welfare state, where we have an economic and social system based on increasing production and increasing wealth. Wealth is unevenly distributed to the point of social and physical distress. We alleviate the distress, or claim we do, with a little rebalance of the system, but just a little, just enough to ensure that the underlying system survives. Transformative change is changing the underlying cause of the problem, which is, for the climate emergency, overproduction. And ironically, for poverty, the problem is still overproduction because it's about distribution. And this is a far more uncomfortable way to think about change. And that's why I come back to Adorno's type of work, for that uncomfortableness. So I just don't get too self-satisfied. And the challenge of creating a more just world from within an unjust world, and with the tools of that unjust world. How do we do that? And I think Manny's talk was brilliant, actually, for answering that question. So the reason I use Adorno is for this relentless questioning that is part of his theory, this staying on guard, avoiding the feel good of, oh, I'm a social justice researcher. And in a quote, he said, the splinter in the eye is the greatest magnifying glass. I mean, that's such an Adorno quote. But I think we need to consider and reconsider ways of theorying to make it possible. So it is this sense of being on our guard and just provisional stabilities at most, and also the imperfect nature of knowing. That probably is one of the most powerful ideas that comes from Adorno's work, and how we destroy if we try and control knowledge too much. And this book, of course, is the book that really sums all of this up. And when we talk about polycrisis, I think this book needs to be more recognized in the current world, of how we destroy ourselves by our attempts to control our world. And Habermas called this the Frankfurt School's bleakest book. And for me, that's why it's so important. And that's why Adorno's work is so important. And I'm not contradicting Manny here. I hope you can see the nuance of the argument. But I am saying that there is something about this needing to hold on to the fact that really things are quite bad. So as I think about this polycrisis, for me, we do need theory that is bleak. That's why I turn to Adorno, although I give him a more positive spin than most. We need to understand the difference between affirmative and transformative change, and I think Fraser is powerful there. But the bleak only makes sense if we understand that which we truly value, which is that destination, or as Manny's termed, the hope. So actually, the bleak only makes sense if we understand that we're still committed to that hope. And I'll stop there. Thank you all.
That's great, Jan. I've been criticised for focusing too much on Adorno, you know, and negativity. But I think that there is definitely something in that last statement that you made from Honneth about what it is that we understanding what it is that we value, and our ability to sit with that kind of bleak almost, and sit with the splinter in the eye to work through that. Reminds me a little bit of the work of Vanessa Andreotti and the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, and thinking about hospicing and the idea of kind of hospicing what is passing away, recovering what it is that we want to carry with us in its ancestral form, or whatever it might be, in order to do something different, you know. So I think that's really powerful. Thank you ever so much. I'd like to thank you all for coming as well, but especially I'd like to extend once again a thanks to both Manny and Jan for their time in preparing for this, and also giving their time to be here today. It's like super important, and I'm very grateful to you both. That was really inspiring. And on that bombshell, I hope that I see you soon.
Nice to see you all. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Manny.
Yeah, no, you're welcome, Jan. You're welcome, Manny. Thanks ever so much.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Richard, do you want us, are we sticking around for this next half hour